Welcome. I'm Sebastian Mahfood, and you're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En Route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom.
Oh, everybody, welcome back. Today we begin our foundational series for Arguments for the Existence of God. Now, this will be a series of arguments, but each argument itself will be a series because I want to take our time. I want to really develop these arguments, help you to understand them, help you to present them. So each argument itself will be somewhere between 2 to 3 episodes, so we can work our way through each of the premises, each of the steps in every one of the arguments, and then also spend time looking at and addressing objections as well. Now, we are going to present you with, or study together, I should say, a myriad of different arguments for God's existence. Now, I will tell you that some of these arguments I think are absolutely successful, and that to try and escape any of them results in incoherency. Some of the other arguments I think are still good, but not quite as compelling. But I guess the point I want to make is that it's the overall force, cumulative force, of the arguments taken as a whole that I believe makes the case for God extremely compelling. Extremely compelling. Now, that's not to say that any one of these arguments can't be convincing on its own. I think that they are. But once you start to add the arguments up, that, I believe, is where the real magic starts to happen for people, especially if they're coming from a very skeptical viewpoint, as I was a number of years ago. It wasn't, in my experience, any one argument that suddenly converted me. It was coming across a series of arguments that I thought definitely had some merit, were certainly plausible, and as I began to study more arguments of that kind, it was both the depth and breadth that eventually overwhelmed me, and I changed my mind. I came to regard these arguments as good arguments, successful arguments. So I want to, again, go deep, so that's why we're going to turn this into a series, but also wide. So we'll cover arguments like the one today, the contingency argument. We will cover arguments from intelligibility. We will go through Aristotelian proofs, Thomistic proofs, Augustinian proofs. We will go through the moral argument. We will go through the Kalam argument. We will go through the fine-tuning argument, teleological argument. I mean, you name it. There's probably about 20 or so arguments that I think are really good arguments for God's existence. Some definitely stronger than others. But I want to present you, and this will take a while. We won't do this series all at once. We'll probably do about one per week, along with everything else we're doing. Develop it in full and respond to objections before moving on to another argument. So that's my plan. Then once we get through the arguments for God's existence, we will then turn to arguments for the second pillar of the minimum effective apologetic, which, of course, is the question of whether or not Jesus is God. And that's where you switch somewhat from philosopher, not entirely, but somewhat from philosopher to historian. But these initial arguments are going to be philosophical in nature. And some of them eventually will look upon scientific evidence as well. But, yeah, that's the plan. And I'm excited. I'm excited to take you through this. I present these arguments a lot in person. I give various talks to local groups, universities. So I figure let's get these on the podcast so I can have these as resources both for the listeners, of course, but for people who have heard or seen me present these, give a talk to come back and study them in more depth. So the one we're going to start with is the famous argument from Contingency, which definitely has roots in Aquinas' third way, but really is better known from Wilhelm Gottfried Leibniz, who, of course, was a brilliant polymath. And I will give a presentation of this argument that I think is very simply presented and that I think is successful. There are, of course, many various developments of this argument. And what I try to do when studying these arguments is I try to find a development that is fairly simple to present, but still rigorous. Now, there are a number of arguments for God's existence, and we'll get into those. For example, I think the Aristotelian proof is extremely good, extremely compelling, but it's pretty technical. It takes a lot of extremely compelling, but it's pretty technical. It takes a lot of wind up. So there's a balance that has to be struck as an apologist where I want to give a simple presentation, but I still want to be able to really defend it. And sometimes the arguments can be presented a little too simply that they become a little more difficult to defend. So the presentations I give you are not the only presentations, but they're developments of the argument that I think are good and worth using and worth having in your apologetic arsenal. So I will always try to present them in the form of a syllogism first, and then we will work on explaining and defending each of the premises. So when we talk about a syllogism, we're talking about a deductive argument. And in a deductive argument, what that means is that if you believe each of the premises are true, or at least more plausibly true than false, the conclusion then follows necessarily, so long as it's valid, so long as it follows the laws of logic. If you believe the premises are true, or more plausibly true than not, the conclusion is inescapable. So then the project there is just to defend the premises and give evidence for why they are true, or again, at least more plausibly true than not. And I keep saying more plausibly true because few things in life, very, very few things in life can be proved with absolute certainty. And most of what the knowledge that we work off of, we are not absolutely certain about, but we believe it's plausibly true, more plausibly true than not. And I think that's a reasonable standard to have a successful argument. So without any further ado, let's talk about the argument for contingency. So if you are not driving or something, you might want to take some notes because we will be going in depth here, and it's worth writing things down because it helps you memorize more. I don't have anything in front of me. I've just written about this so many times. I hopefully should be able to, and presented about it so many times, I hopefully should be able to do so more. The syllogism for the contingency argument that I think is a good one, that is a pretty popular form, is as follows. Premise 1. Everything that exists has an explanation for why it exists, either in a necessity of its own being or an external condition. Allow me to repeat that. Everything that exists has an explanation for why it exists, either in a necessity of its own being or an external condition. Now, some people might use the term external cause. I like to use the term condition. Sometimes people think of causes in too limited of a way that it can bring unnecessary confusion into the argument. So I like the term condition. Okay, so that's premise 1. And premise 2 would be as follows. If the universe has an explanation for its existence, that explanation is God. So a very simple premise there. If the universe has an explanation for its existence, that explanation is God. Now, people might think it's a really bold way of stating a premise. They might be a little weary of that, but that's really the logical equivalent of what many atheists will claim. The atheists will claim that the universe just does not have an explanation for its existence. It's a brute fact, and we'll get on to addressing that point shortly. So there's when you realize that it's a logical equivalent of the atheistic position, it's really not that contentious at all. But that's the second premise, or the step in the argument. If the universe has an explanation for its existence, that explanation is God. Premise 3 is the universe exists, and then it follows deductively from there that God exists as the explanation for the universe. So this argument is absolutely logically valid, meaning if you believe the premises are true, or more plausibly true than not, the conclusion follows necessarily. You cannot escape it. So one more time, premise 1. Everything that exists has a reason. Everything that exists has a reason or an explanation for why it exists, either in an external condition or a necessity of its own being. Premise 2, if the universe has an explanation for its existence, that explanation is God. And premise 3, the universe exists. And then just deductively from there, it would follow that God exists as the explanation for the universe. So now our project here is to explain and defend each of the steps in this syllogism, in this argument. So we'll spend the next couple of minutes working through that, and then on the next episode, we will go a little bit more in depth and look at some common objections. But this one is just trying to give you the general overview. These things are best done when they are taken in steps If we try to do too much at once, we'll get overwhelmed. So let's look at premise one. Now, premise one is really a statement of a very modest form of what's known as the principle of sufficient reason. There are stronger presentations of the principle of sufficient reason that, even though I believe are true, are a little bit more technical or difficult to defend, and I don't think it's necessary to do that, at least in terms of the contingency argument, to have a successful argument. So we're just going to present and defend a very modest version of what's known as the principle of sufficient reason, which is stated in premise one, that everything that exists has an explanation for why it exists, either in one of two things. And this is what Leibniz had to tell us. He said that things can either exist contingently, meaning they exist but they don't have to exist, or they could have existed some other way, or things could exist necessarily, meaning they could not have not existed. Their non-existence is logically impossible. Now let's take a few minutes here to dive a little bit into these two categories. Okay, we have contingency on one hand, and we have necessity on another. So perhaps another way to think about this is anything that is contingent, we could consider that thing a caused cause. Right? It's a caused cause. And anything that is necessary would be an uncaused cause. So what are some examples of contingent things or caused causes? Well, me and you, for example. Human beings. We all exist, but we don't have to exist, or we could have existed in some other way than we currently are. And there's an external condition which explains our existence. So, for example, there's an external condition both in a temporal sense, our parents, and there's an external condition in a vertical sense, or a reason here and now why we exist. And, of course, the types of things that we're made of would explain our existence. So we exist, but we don't have to exist. We are a caused cause. What are some other examples of contingent things? Plants, planets, beavers, books, stars, galaxies, trees, baby food. Pretty much most of what we are familiar with and think of are contingent things. They are caused causes. And of course, what we're eventually getting at, what we're eventually driving to, is that within the totality of reality, meaning within all of reality, there must exist at least one necessary reality, one non-contingent reality, in order to explain why the totality of reality exists at all. So let me explain what I mean by that. If the totality of reality did not have at least one necessary reality, then what we would be saying is that the totality of reality is just a collection of contingent things or caused causes. But that's really saying that the totality of reality would be a collection of things that themselves require a cause to exist. But without that cause there, present for them to exist, then the totality of reality would not exist at all. Follow me on that, I hope? So I'll say it one more time, possibly from a different way. If the totality of reality did not contain at least one necessary reality, a reality that exists through itself, then the existence of reality could not be explained, since all that would be there would be things that themselves require a cause to be there. So all of reality cannot be contingent. And this was one of the great contributions that Leibniz made. He gave us an example of a sort of infinite series of textbooks. And he said that even if you could explain one textbook as being copied from a previous textbook, forward and backwards into infinity, you would still need to explain why there is an infinite series of textbooks at all to begin with. And part of what he is getting at with this example is that even if the universe is past eternal, meaning even if the universe goes back in time forever and goes forward in time forever, the universe itself is still the type of thing that is contingent. It's still a cause. So we have to explain why the universe exists here and now rather than nothing at all. And ultimately, the only way that you can halt an infinite regress is to derive, or arrive, I should say, at some type of necessary reality, some type of uncaused cause that exists through itself that can sort of act as the divine pedestal, if you want to put it that way, to explain why anything exists here and now rather than nothing. So if everything that exists were contingent, just a bunch of causes, and there's no necessary reality to explain their resistance, to hold, to bring and hold those causes into being, then there would be nothing at all. And this, of course, is the reason why Leibniz says the most exquisite question, and indeed the first question any person should ever ask, is why is there something rather than nothing? That famous line that has everything to do with the contingency argument. Because we look around and we see that everything about the kind of world we live in seems to be a caused cause. It exists, but it doesn't have to exist. So why does it exist? And what we do is we can notice that, okay, there seems to be at least a superficial contingency of the universe. It very much seems like I'm definitely contingent because there was a time when I didn't exist. The Earth is definitely contingent because it seems like there's a time the Earth didn't exist, and so on and so forth. But like maybe the fundamental stuff of, maybe that exists necessarily. But here is where we can say, no, there's actually a radical contingency to the universe, because there's nothing about the fundamental stuff of the universe or the laws of nature that are logically necessary. In fact, whether it's fermions and bosons or strings or whatever you want to say or think the fundamental stuff of the universe is, there's nothing logically necessary about it. It could have been some other type of fundamental stuff. Same thing with the laws of nature. They're not like the laws of mathematics in the sense that 2 + 2 necessarily equals 4. The laws of nature could have been some other way. There's nothing logically necessary about them. But anything that could have been other than it is could have not been at all. Now that's a really important thing to understand. Anything that could have been other than it is could not have been at all. And this is why we can see that the universe is not just superficially contingent, it is radically contingent. And this is starting to drive us at what this necessarily would have to be, because it can't be anything that's part of the universe. The universe, any particular thing in the universe, and even the universe as a whole, is contingent. It is a caused cause. So it needs some type of grounding in a necessary reality to explain why it exists instead of nothing. Now, if the universe is just all of space-time reality, there's only really two possible options of what could serve as a necessary reality to explain why the universe exists. And these lists of options are as follows. 1, some type of abstract object, like mathematical entities or the number 7. Some philosophers, not all, but some philosophers believe that abstract objects exist necessarily. We don't have to get too much into detail about that now, but we can use that as an example of some type of a potential necessary being. Now, whether abstract objects actually do exist apart from our minds or apart from the mind of God is a subject we will just necessarily. Now, the problem with positing abstract objects as the sole necessary reality is that they are causally effete. Abstract objects can't cause anything, so they certainly could not serve as the explanation for why something exists rather than nothing. And there's only one other possible ground for a necessary reality that could explain why something exists rather than nothing, and that would be an immaterial mind, or, if you prefer, what everybody most commonly knows to be God. So an immaterial, timeless, spaceless, extremely powerful personal intellect is what this argument gets us as the sole necessary reality, as that which exists through itself. So this isn't a sort of case of special pleading. We're saying that God, we're not saying that God doesn't have an explanation. We're saying that in accordance to the principle of sufficient reason, God is that necessary reality whose existence is explained through himself. He is that which could not have not existed or existed in any other way than he is. He is eternal. He is the uncaused cause and the ultimate explanation for why anything exists over nothing. So that is the short form development of the argument. Of course, it took about 20 minutes. So what we will do next time is we will dig a little bit deeper into each of the steps of the argument, defend each of the premises in a little bit more detail, and then look at some, what I believe are some common objections, but very weak objections, and then look at some of the more forceful objections and how to respond to those as well. So hopefully you found this presentation useful and helpful. If there's any questions you have or points of confusion you would like for me to clear, just drop a comment, send an email. I will be happy to address that. Often the feedback and the dialogue leads to the most productive conversation, and that's what I want to provide for you here. Otherwise, if you enjoy what you hear, if you think that we're doing good stuff, important stuff, and want other people to become a part of it, please do subscribe to the podcast and leave a 5-star review. 5-star reviews really do help raise the show in the rankings, bring new eyeballs, bring new listeners. So if you think that our project is worthy of attention, please consider taking 2 minutes to do that. Thanks, and we'll talk.
We hope you enjoyed the program and will join us back for another show on WCAT Radio. This is Sebastian Mahfood. Good day.